When Allied soldiers entered Germany in 1945, they thought they knew what war looked like. They were wrong. What they found in the bunkers, the forests, the laboratories, and the camps was something no one had prepared them for. Some of it was never made public, some of it changed the world, and some of it is still being uncovered today. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps in the spring of 1945 is documented in photographs and film footage that has been reproduced in countless history books and documentaries. But what those images capture, and what they leave out, are two very different things. The men who were actually present for the liberation of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and the other camps described experiences that photographs simply cannot convey. American forces entered Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945, the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by U.S. troops. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald used for forced labor connected to underground military construction projects. What the soldiers of the 4th Armored Division found there were the bodies of prisoners who had been shot in the days before the liberation, killed by retreating SS guards who did not want witnesses. There were also survivors, men so physically diminished that soldiers who had fought across Europe and seen considerable death described being unable to process what they were looking at. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf shortly after its liberation on April 12, 1945, accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. Eisenhower made an immediate decision. He ordered every available American soldier in the area to tour the camp, then sent word to Washington requesting that journalists, photographers, and members of Congress be brought to see what he had seen. His reasoning, communicated in messages sent in the days following the visit, was that the evidence needed to be documented beyond any possibility of future denial. What he and the others saw at Ohrdruf included piles of prisoner bodies, a gallows used for public executions, a burned pyre where bodies had been partially incinerated before liberation, and a shed containing additional bodies. Patton, a man who had witnessed extreme violence throughout his military career, reportedly became physically ill and left the shed. When American forces reached Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, the day before Eisenhower's Ohrdruf visit, they found approximately 21,000 survivors. The physical state of those survivors, their extreme emaciation, their medical conditions, the range of injuries and diseases present, was described by liberators in terms that consistently acknowledged the inadequacy of language. But the condition of survivors was only one part of what was found at Buchenwald. The camp also contained evidence of medical experiments conducted on prisoners by SS physicians, experiments that had been running for years with no ethical framework, no informed consent, and no purpose that served the prisoners in any way. What those experiments were, and what happened to the people who endured them, is one of the darkest chapters of what was found after 1945. The systematic documentation of Nazi medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners was one of the most disturbing aspects of the post-war investigations. When Allied personnel, military doctors, legal investigators, and later the prosecution team for the Nuremberg medical trial went through the records left behind in the camps and in German medical institutions, what they found was a body of documentation that was both clinically detailed and morally incomprehensible. The experiments had been conducted across multiple camp systems, most extensively at Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Buchenwald. They were not the work of a small number of rogue individuals. They were authorized at senior levels of the SS medical hierarchy, conducted by qualified physicians with medical degrees from German universities, and documented in research files that were maintained, cross-referenced, and in some cases submitted to academic and military institutions as legitimate scientific contributions. At Dachau, prisoners had been subjected to high-altitude experiments, placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate the conditions experienced by Luftwaffe pilots at extreme altitude, with the explicit aim of determining the point at which exposure would cause death and what methods might extend survival. The experiments were not designed to protect the prisoners. They were designed to collect data on human physiology under conditions that could not be ethically replicated. Prisoners who survived the chamber sessions were sometimes subjected to follow-on experiments. Many did not survive. Also at Dachau, prisoners had been subjected to hypothermia experiments, immersed in ice water, or exposed to sub-zero outdoor temperatures, to determine how long German pilots or soldiers could survive exposure to extreme cold and what methods of rewarming were most effective. The data collected from these experiments recorded precisely how long it took for a human being to die from cold exposure under controlled conditions. Hundreds of prisoners were subjected to these procedures. A significant number died. At Ravensbrück, the experiments documented by Allied investigators included surgical procedures conducted on female prisoners without anesthesia or consent, bone, muscle, and nerve removal and transplantation to study regeneration and wound treatment for military applications. The women subjected to these procedures, many of them Polish political prisoners who became known after the war as the Ravensbrück Rabbits, suffered permanent physical damage, chronic pain, and in some cases died from post-operative infections or the procedures themselves. At Auschwitz, the experiments conducted under Josef Mengele, who held the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer and served as a camp physician, have become the most widely known, partly because Mengele survived the war and escaped justice, and partly because the scope and nature of his work was so extensively documented by survivors. Mengele was particularly focused on twins, subjecting matched pairs to procedures whose stated purpose was the study of genetics and heredity, but whose actual conduct involved procedures that served no legitimate scientific function and caused severe harm and death. When Allied investigators documented the physical evidence of these experiments, the surgical wards, the record files, the preserved specimens, and the survivors themselves, they were looking at something that had no precedent in the history of modern medicine. The Nuremberg medical trial, which ran from December 1946 to August 1947, prosecuted 23 German physicians and medical administrators. 7 were sentenced to death and executed. 9 received prison sentences. 7 were acquitted. The trial produced one lasting significant outcome beyond its verdicts: the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles governing the ethical conduct of human medical experimentation that became the foundation of modern medical ethics and research regulation. The code established that voluntary informed consent is an absolute requirement for human experimentation, a principle that had to be written into law because the evidence from the camps made clear it had not previously been treated as one. One of the most physically striking discoveries made by Allied forces advancing through Germany in 1945 was the scale and sophistication of the underground industrial infrastructure that the Nazi regime had constructed in the final years of the war. As Allied strategic bombing campaigns increasingly targeted German industrial production from 1943 onward, the Nazi war economy made a systematic decision to move critical manufacturing underground, into tunnels, mines, caves, and purpose-built underground chambers that bombing could not reach. The construction of these facilities was carried out by concentration camp prisoners and forced laborers under conditions that were deliberately lethal. Workers were consumed by the construction process and replaced continuously from the camp system. The most significant and best documented of these underground facilities was the Mittelwerk, the Central Works, located in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, carved into a tunnel system, originally used for storing fuel and chemicals. The Mittelwerk was the primary production facility for the Vi-2 ballistic missile, the world's first operational ballistic missile, designed by Werner von Braun and his team at Peenemünde and relocated underground after the RAF bombing of the Peenemünde research station in August 1943. When American forces of the 3rd Armored Division entered the Mittelwerk on April 11, 1945, they found a facility that defied easy comprehension. The tunnel system extended for miles through the mountain. Inside were assembly lines for V-2 missiles at various stages of completion, machine tools, components, partially assembled rockets, the entire industrial apparatus of a major weapons manufacturing operation, transferred underground and still running at the moment of its capture. They also found the Dora concentration camp, officially Mittelbau Dora, which had been the source of the labor that built and operated the Mittelwerk. The camp had held tens of thousands of prisoners over its operational life, and the mortality rate among those who worked in the tunnels was catastrophic. Prisoners worked in shifts around the clock, in tunnels filled with dust and toxic fumes. sleeping in the tunnels themselves during the early construction phase because the surface facilities were inadequate. Estimates of the total number who died at Dora and its subcamps range from 20,000 to 25,000. More people than were killed by the V-2 missiles the facility produced. The American forces who captured the Mittelwerk and the surrounding area also found something else. Approximately 100 complete and partially complete V-2 missiles, along with the technical documentation for the program. Under an operation later known as Operation Paperclip, the United States rapidly moved to extract both the physical hardware and the human expertise. Werner von Braun and more than 100 of his technical team surrendered to American forces and were subsequently brought to the United States, where they formed the core of what eventually became NASA's rocket program. The Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon in 1969 was the direct descendant of technology developed in the Mittelwerk by slave labor. Other underground facilities discovered in 1945 included a jet aircraft manufacturing plant in a former salt mine, an aircraft engine factory near Nordhausen, and a network of partially completed underground chambers in the Austrian Alps intended to house the Nazi leadership if Germany's surface infrastructure collapsed. The scale of what the Nazi economy had accomplished in relocating critical production underground, at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, was something Allied planners had not fully anticipated. Among the most consequential discoveries of 1945 were not physical objects, but paper, the records, files, correspondence, and documentation that the Nazi regime had maintained throughout its 12 years in power, and that survived the war in quantities that Allied investigators found staggering. The Nazi state was, in one of its defining characteristics, a bureaucracy. Its crimes were not conducted in secret darkness. They were administered, documented, and archived. The records of the final solution, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, were not destroyed, they were captured. And the completeness of those records, the administrative precision with which the machinery of mass murder had been documented, was something that the investigators who first went through them found deeply disturbing in its own right. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe from 1941, filed regular operational reports to Berlin. Captured intact, these reports recorded the number of people killed in each operation, broken down by category: men, women, children, along with location, method, and date. The language was bureaucratic. The format was administrative routine. The subject was mass killing. The records of the Wannsee Conference, the January 1942 meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of the final solution, had been copied in multiple sets. One copy survived intact in the files of the German Foreign Office and was discovered by American investigators. The Wannsee Protocol runs to 15 pages and describes, in the language of German administrative procedure, the plan for the systematic murder of all Jewish people in Europe. 11 million people are listed. The sheer volume of documentation captured in 1945 took decades to fully process and translate. These documents became the evidentiary foundation of the Nuremberg trials, allowing prosecutors to build cases not primarily through witness testimony, but through the regime's own records. For the defendants at Nuremberg, the existence of such comprehensive documentation was catastrophic to their defense. It was impossible to deny the authenticity of documents captured from German archives. The documents also produced, over the following decades, a steady stream of historical revelation about individuals who had participated in the regime's crimes and subsequently rebuilt their lives, about decisions made at the highest levels and subsequently obscured, and about the full scope of what had been done in ways that even the Nuremberg trials had not completely captured. When Allied forces swept through Germany and its former occupied territories in 1945, they encountered evidence of one of the largest organized theft operations in human history. The Nazi regime had spent 12 years systematically looting the art, cultural property, personal possessions, and financial assets of the people and nations it had conquered or persecuted, and the physical evidence of that looting, stored in salt mines, castles, tunnels, and private estates, was scattered across the collapsing Reich. The Alta See salt mine in Austria was among the most significant individual discoveries. American forces reached it in May 1945 and found, stored in the chambers of the mine, thousands of artworks, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, decorative objects that had been accumulated for the Führer Museum, the enormous art museum that Hitler planned to build in Linz, his Austrian hometown, as a monument to German cultural supremacy. The works in the mine included some of the most important pieces in European cultural history. Among them, the Ghent altarpiece, a 15th-century Flemish masterpiece that had been looted from Belgium, and Vermeer's The Astronomer, looted from the Rothschild collection in France. The Merkers salt mine in Thuringia produced a different and equally staggering discovery. When American troops entered in April 1945, they found the bulk of the German Reichsbank's gold reserves, hundreds of tons of gold bars, along with currency from multiple countries and bags of gold and silver items collected from victims of the concentration camps. The gold from camp victims, rings, jewelry, dental gold, had been melted down and converted into Reichsbank holdings. What the soldiers found at Merkers was, in part, the material residue of the murder of millions of people. The scale of the looting operation became clearer as investigators worked through captured records of the agencies responsible. The Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenbergs, the task force that had systematically looted Jewish cultural property across occupied Europe, had maintained detailed inventories of what it had taken and from whom, listing tens of thousands of individual items removed from Jewish homes, libraries, synagogues, and community organizations across France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. The restitution process that followed was lengthy, incomplete, and in many cases still ongoing. Works looted from Jewish families and scattered through the German museum system, private collections, and the art market continued to surface decades later. Cases brought by the heirs of looting victims resulted in the return of works from major museums into the 21st century. Some works have never been found. Beyond the V-2 rocket program, Allied investigators in 1945 found evidence of a range of weapons development programs that were sufficiently advanced or sufficiently alarming in their implications to reshape military technology in the years that followed. German jet aircraft technology was the most immediately significant discovery for aviation. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, had been in service with the Luftwaffe since 1944, and its performance characteristics substantially exceeded anything the Allied air forces were flying. When the war ended, Allied powers, American, British, and Soviet, made deliberate efforts to capture Me-262 aircraft in flyable condition, along with the engineers who had designed them and the documentation that described how they were built. The British and Americans also found advanced German submarine technology, specifically the Type 21 U-boat, a design that incorporated a substantially larger battery capacity than previous submarine designs and allowed extended underwater operation at speeds that would have significantly complicated Allied anti-submarine warfare. The Type 21 was entering service as the war ended, with only a small number operational. The technical data captured from the program influenced submarine design in multiple countries for decades afterward. German work on what might have become a nuclear weapons program was the subject of intense Allied investigation through a program known as the Alsos Mission, which followed Allied forces through Europe specifically to locate and secure German nuclear research materials, personnel, and documentation. What the Alsos mission found was both alarming and reassuring. The German nuclear program, known as the Uranverein, had been actively pursued, but had not come close to producing a working weapon. The German scientists involved, including Werner Heisenberg, had made a series of theoretical and practical errors that left the program significantly behind the parallel American Manhattan Project. The Alsos mission also secured Germany's supply of uranium ore, approximately 1,200 tons, stored at a paper mill in Stassfurt, to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. 10 German nuclear scientists, including Heisenberg, were captured and held at Farm Hall, a house in Cambridgeshire, England, where their conversations were secretly recorded. The recordings, declassified in 1992, captured the scientists' reactions when informed in August 1945 that the United States had used an atomic bomb against Japan. Their responses, ranging from disbelief to attempts to reconstruct where their own program had fallen short, constitute one of the most remarkable documents in the scientific history of the war. German chemical weapons stockpiles were another alarming discovery. Germany had produced enormous quantities of nerve agents, specifically tabun and sarin, developed by German chemists in the 1930s and early 1940s and entirely unknown to Allied forces until captured documents revealed their existence. Germany had not used these agents in combat, but the stockpiles existed and were substantial. The discovery that Germany had developed chemical weapons substantially more lethal than anything in Allied inventories was, even in retrospect, deeply unsettling. One of the most disturbing discoveries of the post-war period was not found in a bunker or a mine. It was found in the absence of people who should have been there, the SS officers, camp commanders, and administrators of the Nazi genocide, who had simply vanished by the time Allied investigators came looking for them. The scale of the disappearance was extraordinary. The Holocaust had been administered by thousands of individuals across the SES, the German civil service, the railway system, and the military. Many of these individuals were identified in the captured records. Their names, their roles, their specific actions were documented. And yet, when Allied and subsequently German and Israeli investigators searched for them, a substantial number were simply gone. The escape networks that facilitated this disappearance were real and organized. The most significant were the so-called rat lines, routes through which former SS and other Nazi personnel made their way out of Germany, typically through Italy, and then to South America or the Middle East, where they could establish new identities. The Catholic Church's role in some of these escape routes, specifically through institutions run by individual clergy members who assisted former Nazis, became the subject of historical investigation that produced documentation of genuine complicity in a number of cases. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who had been a primary administrator of the logistics of the final solution, coordinating the transportation of Jewish people from across Europe to the death camps, was among those who successfully disappeared. He lived under a false name in Argentina for 15 years before being located by Israeli intelligence, abducted from Buenos Aires in May 1960, brought to Israel, tried, convicted, and executed in 1962. His trial produced the first extensive public account of the bureaucratic machinery of the final solution, told through Eichmann's own testimony. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz physician, also escaped, making his way through Italy to Argentina, where he lived openly using his own name for a period before relocating to Paraguay and subsequently to Brazil. He was never captured. He died in 1979 when he suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach near Sao Paulo and drowned. His remains were identified through dental records in 1985, confirmed by DNA, testing in 1992. For decades after the war, the search for Mengele was one of the most active ongoing investigations of the Nazi hunters, the term used for the investigators, lawyers, and former prisoners who dedicated themselves to locating and prosecuting surviving perpetrators. The discovery, over decades, of perpetrators who had successfully rebuilt their lives in Germany itself, sometimes in positions of public prominence, was perhaps the most persistently unsettling dimension of the post-war accounting. Former SS officers who had served in administrative roles in the camp system were found working as lawyers, teachers, government officials, and business executives. The systematic investigation of these cases was not undertaken with full seriousness by West German authorities until the establishment of the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg in 1958, 13 years after the war ended. Among the discoveries that post-war investigators found most difficult to address in any comprehensive way was the evidence of what the Nazi regime had done to the children of occupied Europe, specifically through the Lebensborn program and the related practice of the forced removal and Germanization of children from occupied territories. The Lebensborn program, the name means spring of life, had been established by the SS in 1935 as a program to support the birth and care of children who met the regime's racial standards. It operated maternity homes across Germany and later in occupied territories, providing care for unmarried mothers whose children were deemed racially acceptable and encouraging births that would contribute to the numerical growth of what the regime classified as the German racial community. But the program's activities in the occupied territories extended beyond the support of voluntary births. In Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, and other occupied countries, SS personnel and civilian administrators systematically identified children who appeared to conform to the regime's physical standards for racial acceptability, typically involving measurements of facial features, hair and eye color, and other characteristics associated with the Nazi conception of Northern European physical type, and removed them from their families for transfer to Germany. The children removed in this process were given German names, placed in German families or institutions, taught to speak German, and raised as Germans. Their original identities were in many cases deliberately obscured. Records were falsified, original names were suppressed, and in some cases, the children were too young to remember their origins by the time the war ended. When Allied forces and post-war child welfare organizations attempted to locate and repatriate these children, they faced extraordinary complexity. Some children had been genuinely integrated into German families with no memory of any other life. Some had lost all family members to the war and occupation. The records of the Lebensborn program itself were incomplete, having been partially destroyed before capture. Estimates of the total number of children removed range from 50,000 to 200,000, a range that reflects the fundamental difficulty of determining the true scale of what had been done. For many of these children, the discovery of their origins came decades later, through genealogical research, DNA testing, and the work of organizations in Norway, Poland, and other countries that have continued searching for records and descendants into the 21st century. Some found living relatives, others found only documentation of families that had been destroyed. The youngest victims of the Lebensborn program were, in many cases, the last to learn what had been done to them. In some ways, the most haunting dimension of what investigators discovered after 1945 is not what they found, but what they didn't. The physical assets of the Nazi regime, gold, art, stolen property, were never fully recovered. Estimates of the total value of what was looted across occupied Europe vary widely, but a substantial fraction was never found. Some was hidden, some was destroyed. Some made its way through the post-war art market into private and public collections under provenance histories that obscured its origins. The complete personnel records of the SS were never recovered. Portions were destroyed in the war's final days. Portions were captured by the Soviets and held in closed archives until after the Cold War. The gaps in surviving records meant that a significant number of individuals who had served in the SS could never be definitively placed at specific locations at specific times, a gap that defense attorneys in post-war trials regularly exploited. The fate of Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi state's final years, remained unresolved for decades. He was reported by multiple witnesses to have been killed attempting to escape Berlin. His remains were found during construction work in Berlin in 1972 and identified forensically. DNA testing in 1998 confirmed the identification with certainty. But the decades of uncertainty had allowed conspiracy theories to develop that proved remarkably persistent. In 2012, a collection of more than 1,400 artworks was found in a Munich apartment belonging to Cornelius Gerlit, the son of a Nazi-era art dealer. The collection contained works looted from Jewish owners across Europe, and its discovery led to years of legal proceedings about restitution that were still ongoing at the time of Gerlit's death in 2014. The search goes on. 80 years after the end of the war, the full accounting of what the Nazi regime did, what it took, what it destroyed, and what traces it left behind has not been completed. What 1945 opened was not a closed chapter, but a process. One that each generation has inherited and continued, with new tools, new archives, and sometimes new discoveries that require the history to be written again. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.